you will have heard it countless of times on this programme. It means literally gross domestic product, but in effect it means economic growth. We measure growth by assessing the sum total of consumption, of investment, of government spending and export, all in a single country, and it added up to a figure. Now, the reason why we're focusing on this today is because 2014 marks the 80th anniversary of this term, GDP. But is it time to reconsider what's become an all-important formula? We'll consider that in a moment. But first, Caroline Hepker has been looking at this for Business Edition.
Gross domestic product isn't just a number, it's been a great leap forward. It was created originally as gross national product in 1934 by this man, Nobel laureate Simon Kuznets. Why? Because the Great Depression made US policymakers realise they needed better information to deal with a national disaster. GDP painstakingly adds up all the output of people, companies and governments in one country. The idea was swiftly adopted around the world, and over the decades it has helped governments to stimulate growth, battle inflation and increase trade. But GDP has not been without its critics. In 1972, the King of Bhutan adopted gross national happiness as a more holistic measure of the progress of his Himalayan people. And in 1990, the UN came up with a broader Human Development Index that takes into account factors like health, education and gender equality. And yet still, Professor Kuznets' GDP remains the granddaddy, perhaps one of the 20th century's greatest inventions.
Caroline Hepker there. So is it time to have a more holistic, possibly, view, or a different view from what constitutes economic growth? Let's get the views of economist Michael Green. He's executive director of the non-for-profit organisation Social Progress Imperative. First, why is this important? Why do we worry about the definition of an acronym? It sounds a bit arcane.
Jamie, it really, really matters because since we are what we measure, the things that we measure are the things that we go after. So if we say that the thing that really matters for our country is more GDP, then we'll focus our effort, the efforts of our politicians and our government policies on more GDP. So measuring what matters is really, really important.
And you think we're measuring the wrong things. What wrong things are we measuring?
Well, it's not the wrong things, but I think GDP is an incomplete measure. Indeed, Simon Kuznets, who invented it, said at the very launch of the idea of GDP, don't use this to measure the well-being of an economy. And indeed, he disowned his invention because he said, you know, you're not measuring unpaid work.
So give me an example of where we go wrong in terms of, because we're looking at, as you say, at the wrong things. I'm sorry, I'm continuing with this theme of it being wrong, but that's what I feel.
So GDP measures things where there's a financial transaction.
Yeah.
So Kuznets' point was, if I'm a house husband and I iron my wife's shirt, that doesn't count as an economic transaction, add to GDP. If I go out to work and pay someone to do it, that counts. So the work, anything that's unpaid doesn't count. That was one of his big objections. It doesn't say anything about environmental sustainability. It doesn't say anything, I mean, Bobby Kennedy had made this great speech in 1968 saying, it doesn't measure the things about the real quality of our life, about the quality of our education, the communities we live in. So it has odd
things, does it? Odd effects when, for instance, there's a disaster. Because GDP always goes up because of the amount of money which is spent on repairing the disaster, but of course it doesn't take into account the ghastly existence of the people who are suffering from the disaster.
Yes, you saw a bounce in Japanese GDP after the Fukushima disaster because of all the money spent clearing that up. Is that really progress? Is putting people in jail really progress? That all
counts towards GDP?
We're spending money on it. It's economic activity. It's GDP.
Okay, so what do we do instead?
Well, I think what I'm working on is something called the Social Progress Index, and that's trying to measure the well-being of countries entirely on social and environmental indicators, real outcomes. Do my kids get an education? Is there a good healthcare system? Do I live in a tolerant society? And those two, I would call those things the real things that matter to real people. And we're not doing this to replace GDP, but to put it alongside. And then we can say, well, if GDP goes up, does social progress go up? And the good news is it does.
How do you measure some of those things? Because you're talking about something different. You're talking about a kind of happiness index, aren't you, here? Which is, we talked about a lot on this programme before. Yeah. But how do you measure those things?
Well, one is you can measure happiness by surveys and say, are you happy? And you can say, well...
That just happens to be how they feel on the day.
Yeah, so you can say, well, there's some more sophistication to that. But you can say Denmark is happier than Britain. Well, what do? Do we have to learn Danish, watch more episodes of Borgen? I don't know. Happiness is an interesting set of study, but it doesn't tell you what to do about it. What we're doing is by measuring real outcomes in terms of educational attainment and all these sort of outcome measures, you actually then can say, where's a country falling behind? Where does it need improvement?
So can you give me an example of what kind of buttons are we pressing at the moment in order to increase GDP when we should be pressing other buttons which would raise a wider definition of economic well-being?
Yeah. Well, I mean, a huge hole, of course, in GDP is it says nothing about environmental sustainability. So that's one key issue. That actually, you've got to look at how, what we find is that actually social progress tails off as GDP rises. The rate of growth slows, because often countries are hitting headwinds around environmental sustainability. And another big news item we've seen today has been about the rise of obesity in developing countries. Countries are getting richer and they're moving to new health problems.
But balancing it, for instance, on the environmental one sounds very interesting because as you, for instance, promote growth, push for growth in terms of economic growth, you have to work out whether that's going to improve or erode environmental sustainability. Yeah. Now, that relationship hasn't been worked out yet. We don't know. I mean, it's going to be an extraordinarily complex and difficult way of gauging what's going on in the economy.
Yeah, and that's why we're trying to start work on this by constructing the measure. Because people have been talking about finding alternative measures to GDP for quite a while. Back in 2008, the Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz produced this report about it. And it sort of defined some of the parameters. The social progress imperative, we've gone out and started trying to do it. And putting out there, it's there for people. It's got to be tested, it's got to be improved. But hopefully it's going to help us understand what, when we talk about inclusive growth, it really means.
What it does mean. Michael Green, thanks very much indeed for that.
Thank you, Jamie.
Now let's have a look at the main story from the BBC.